I'll send it to Go Alpha team so they can share it. All right. Seems like more people are gonna join in, but I think we can just start the conversation kind of lightly. So to start off, once again, I want to attend yesterday's, but I couldn't. So I'm just kind of curious, like how we went, and then would there be any lessons for example, other CVCs to also learn? Because I know that it's not out on the YouTube yet or others for me to look at. And feel free to speak or share on the chat.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, so as I just wrote in chat, I was hoping to not talk at all potentially on these calls and just do participate in the chat. But then immediately it came up on the call yesterday that there's a bunch of like very sort of fundamental considerations about what's CVCs even supposed to do and how do they interact with delegates and how do they interact with the advisory councils and so on. So I ended up talking a whole bunch about that. But also, I mean, that's going to be in the recording. So there's a bunch of like Rune Radio of related to these topics from that recording yesterday. And maybe what we could try today is that, I mean, there's a lot of the delegates and other facilitators and so on that were on the call yesterday, and also Kianga. So maybe what we could try is that other people basically try to sort of discuss and based on sort of the processing of all the stuff I was saying yesterday, and we can get closer to a kind of, you know, sort of ecosystem intelligence, to use that phrase, for sort of the logic of what other CVC is supposed to do. So I'll try to stick to the chat and write some points in the chat and then see if that helps kind of spark some people going on voice and discussing it would do.
Yes, that sounds like a good idea. And since it's also initial stage, I do think that we can use such platform to discuss different ideas. But of course, for others, please be respectful for each other because I do want it to be productive discussion. All right. So, all right. Seems like 3F delegate has something to share.
Hey, dude. Thanks for having this CVC first CVC call for Growth CVC. So it looks like this week the topic is the merging of the stability and liquidity scope with the decentralized collateral scope and RWA scope into the stability scope. So kind of wanted to, constitutional delegates are no longer obviously pushing a narrative, if I understand it correctly. So this is coming up in the April governance cycle. Kind of wanted to get your thoughts there, how your CVC would interpret something like this, which is part of the MIP 102 sub-proposal. Again, the merging of the stability and liquidity scope with decentralized collateral and the RWA scope into one. So, from our perspective, I can kind of give your CVC some ideas on how your CVC should proceed with this recommendation, this MIP 102 sub-proposal. We believe that the proposal to merge these three scopes into a single stability scope is going to simplify and streamline the governance process, right? So I think it's going to make decision making related to stability, liquidity, and collateral onboarding, et cetera, a lot easier. There's a lot of good benefits that we see here, such as efficiency, right? It's going to improve the efficiency. It's going to be a lot more efficient by merging the scopes. And it's also going to better use the resource, allocate the resources that are out there, which is very limited right now, as you know, right? So combining those scopes can lead to better allocation of resources and hopefully identify the common goals that that the facilitator or facilitators of these scopes are going to be managing, and also not to forget the ACs, which is the advisory council members, right? So kind of want to push the narrative that this is a good sub-proposal, MIP 102 sub-proposal, to merge MIP 103, 104, and 105. So want to hear your thoughts there, man. Kick things off.
Yeah, but I also want to kind of come back to what Rune also kind of shared, is that so we do want to talk about those, but also want to talk about some of like fundamental, for example, role of CVC and also CDs in the first place, because I think that also has been something, especially from the last night's CVC call, seems like that was a topic that many want to discuss. But in response to your point, is that especially from the like a cautious Dove side, like we do think that having more efficiency as well as like experiment and those growths make sense. Of course, for the details, I'll need help from both CDs and others to give some guidance, like what you did. But at the same time, I also want to be kind of fair for today's call, since today's call is also about like at least for now, I want to kind of talk about some of the fundamental aspect as well. So is it okay if we talk about some of the fundamental ones first, and then if you have time left, we can come back to some of those scopes?
Sure. It's your castle, for lack of a better word.
It's a shared castle, so not just my castle. All right. So Rune had a very good question about how delegates should distinguish themselves for the CVC by trying to be as helpful as possible, but they shouldn't be political or sort of visions or ideology. Instead, they should help translate the intentions and ideas of the CVCs into practical governance technical reality. So this was a part that we want to kind of discuss. Like, so we already know that delegates are supposed to be very helpful to CVC, but I do understand that there have been some questions about like how to be helpful, as well as like some of the expectations, right? So I think it'll be also good to hear from like constitutional, delegates, or at least because for now they're technically no constitutional, delegates in the process. But for those who are interested, to be like, okay, what are some of the areas that you feel like that you can help, as well as also talk about like, is it kind of realistic to, for example, like, because I know that we talk about potentially having a constitutional delegate to be kind of moderator, right? So especially in CVC calls, for example, like some of those guidance or others, like they can maybe lead some of it. Like, is it also kind of like expectation that's reasonable? I do want to have such conversations. So if anybody wants to give their thoughts, happy to hear.
Yeah, as far as I've understood it, or my view on the issue is that it's basically more like a advisory role in terms of like organizational knowledge or institutional knowledge, right? So like, for instance, let's say this MIP 102 proposal is like up for discussion at the moment that Frank mentioned. Then, for instance, I would, know that, like, I'm just making this up now, that I don't know, like BA Labs is vehemently opposed to whoever's like the ALM poncho at the moment, right? And I would say, I think the proposal is good. It would help to streamline the discussions and reduce siloing of information. However, I want to point out that BA Labs, who are the facilitator of the stability and liquidity scope, are vehemently opposed to this other guy who they would have to work together. So we need to find a solution there. I think like that, at least from my understanding, is how I would ideally behave as a delegate. I would not even push any opinion of my own, I think, here.
And also, Ruben, actually feel free to talk as well. Like especially in the initial stage, I think we'll all appreciate also you sharing some of the insights as well. Because it seems like that you have an idea that advisory and also delegates should work together to. Well, actually, so in this regard, like, are they supposed to work together, or is it supposed to be like separate? Like, what's your kind of take on it?
Yeah. So okay, let me just quickly. I mean, I really want to. I want to try to see if I can put enough sort of balls in the air to then let the discussion happen, kind of with me just sitting and writing stuff in the chat. But so what we got to yesterday, right, was this discussion about, okay, delegates are not supposed to be pushing the vision, pushing their, like, they shouldn't be introducing bias into the CVC, right? They should be introducing facts. And then the CVC is responsible for the bias, essentially. And then there's this whole thing of like the natural topic and the way that CVCs get kind of expert input as well, because delegates are smart. They're very good at governance, but they're not experts in like ALM or something, right? Or they don't have to be, and they're not supposed to be. And the place where that kind of specialized expertise comes from are the advisory councils, right? So these are companies like it could be like a consultants like Deloitte or something, or Kroll is an example of some that have actually been like there have actually been interactions with Kroll about providing expert advice on ALM for us. And then what we got to is this thing of like, okay, so when CVCs are like thinking about what do we want to do next, they should be thinking like very long term. They should be thinking about like proactively, how do we make sure, like, what's the thing we got to make sure is under control for the next year, 2 years, right? That so not like short term putting out fires or something. I mean, at least not in the long run. They might have to if it happens, but in this early stage, basically that's gonna be like people like me and people like the facilitators and the former coins. We're gonna be the ones that like put out fires and do maybe 1 or 2 edits and all that stuff, right? And then eventually that's going to end, and then it will be all up to the CVCs to run everything. But in this early stage, the CVC should instead be all about getting the sort of grips of these different levers, and so ideally not get distracted by this like the very short-term things, but focus on sort of some specific important long-term things. And then for stability, it's my opinion that, and this is sort of then, this is how I'm trying to start the whole CVC process, is by sort of bringing this opinion to the table. And then the idea is for the CVCs to basically figure out then their position on this particular opinion, and maybe if there's some other opinions that are more important. And in the end, it always ends up translating into a position document for a scope framework, right? And okay, so the opinion that I think is so crucial to get into the stability scope framework. So that's technically, that would right now be the decentralized collateral scope framework, because that's where the advisory council will sit for all 3 of the stability scopes. So stability, liquidity, decentralized collateral, and real asset collateral will all have their advisory council sitting in decentralized collateral starting from next month if the current edits are accepted. And the advisory council is what the CVCs use to sort of orient themselves and do things, right? They sort of tell the facilitators, you need to hire these kinds of advisors, and you need to give them these kinds of tasks, and here's how much you're allowed to pay them, right? And this is how you should negotiate with them, and this is how you should follow up, and so on, right? Okay, and then so okay, this is all built up. Finally, the point is, as I also wrote in the chat, that I think the number 1 priority is getting ALM under control. So like figuring out what to do with assets when they come in, what to sort of do automatically with assets as they come in without having to make any other decisions, right? So do we just keep it all as USDC? Do we put it into longer term, low risk assets like we're currently doing, and at a sort of in a more manual way? Although already like the scopes already have some like logic in there that's going to do this stuff automatically, but they're very arbitrary and not very well made currently. And more than anything else, I think that there's a huge upside, not just in terms of fixing like a short-term problem of like getting some better parameters in there, but having the CVCs as a whole, getting some kind of sense and intuition of what is ALM, how do we deal with it, who are the experts we go to when we need stuff done related to it, and how much do we pay them, and how do we verify that they did a good job. For me, that is like the crucial priority. And then the second to that, the other crucial priority is to make sure we don't get distracted from this first priority, because that's always been the problem with Maker, right? Is then 1 week we've got one thing, that's the big thing, and then the next week we've got the next thing, and then we've got the third thing, and then we never get any of that stuff done, right? And there's a lot of incentives and a lot of dynamics that makes this stuff happen automatically, because you've always got some person or some whatever with some new thing and a new pitch and a new idea and so on, right? So that's ultimately what I'm arguing for, is that the CVC should think about language that, number one, specifies what exactly we want the first project to be, and I think it should be ALM, and I think it should be like very clearly defined what we mean with ALM, right? Updates to the elements that have to do with ALM and only that. And then also specify language that basically says the facilitators simply are not allowed to do other stuff. Like they're not allowed to do a financial risk project if they don't have the ALM project already running very well, right? Because this is kind of, I keep using this example, right? But this could be an example of something, well, financial risk, that's a lot more exciting and fun, and everybody wants to do it. And ALM, that's a little bit more boring, and not so many people want to do it. And then it's just easy to fall in the trap of, oh, then we just do the exciting thing. But financial risk is just not, like the upside on that isn't there unless ALM is done first, is my sort of uninformed opinion. I still don't, I mean, that's my understanding from the various experts that we already had. And I guess also another thing is CVCs could try to ask people from real assets or SF or so to come and sort of explain this, like talk more about this as well, right? And get a sense of then, okay, what language do you put in there to like, who are the top, what's the kind of counterparty we want to hire to be the expert in this? Should it be a big company that does a giant $1 million project or something? Or maybe initially it should be more like some more smaller scale, more, crypto native ex-bankers or something that can help us with it. These are all the things that can be considered. And then the question is ultimately, and this is like the big challenge, is one thing is the opinion and the thought and the feeling about it, but then how to actually turn that into language that gives us the result that we want. And this question of like how to turn it into language that gives us the result that we want, this is one of the areas where I think delegates, they really can work on distinguishing themselves, right? Because they can do that while remaining fully impartial, right? They can simply say, okay, this is what you're saying that you want. And we believe that if you put this in your position document, then you will get a result that likely corresponds the most with what you probably desire based on what you've said. All right, I'll shut up.
Just one question, follow-up here, if I may. Like, who's expressing the intention of the CVCs? I mean, that would be the members and the head, right? Like they all together would discuss about like what they want to achieve. Is that correct?
Yeah. And also, I mean, and this is a good, like, so, okay, let me just talk a little bit about this dynamic again between them, right? So the thing is, CVCs do not have a formal way of giving a command to a delegate, for instance. I mean, they could informally do it by like, say, I mean, you know how many of us have a majority in the CVC, so we can give you a command, right? I mean, sort of informally by like, I mean, if you have a multisig of 3 people and 2 of them says, do this or do something with a multisig, then informally, obviously that can create a sort of instruction, right? That is easy to understand and follow. But there isn't like a formal mechanism that says if a CVC does blah, 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 then a delegate has to do blah, blah, right? Rather, it all comes down to whether CVCs end up basically choosing to ban delegates that don't do a good enough job. That's one sort of very harsh, I guess you could say, very sort of strict way to get delegates to do the bidding of CVCs. But the other one is that delegates, I mean, this is kind of the dynamic I think will dominate, right? Is that delegates will, on the CVC platform, have a platform basically where they can showcase their skills and showcase their value to the MKR holders, right? So that's the place where delegates can think about how do we generate votes for us, delegation to us that from people that support this CVC, right? And so it's almost like delegates have to ideally, predict what the CVCs want based on because the CVCs are kind of going to be very casual, right? So they really want the more they can get everything on a silver platter, the better. And of course, it's a hard challenge, right? Currently, maybe it's easier because all we've got to do for growth, for instance. Anyway, I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I just have a quick question, especially regarding dynamic between CVC and advisor. So, for example, let's say that for stability scope, we have advisor, and then they suggest something. And then let's say they suggest the same thing for each CVC. So whether that's a Growth CVC, CVC, or Refi CVC. Now, all of the CVC, they might have a different ideas about the direction, but then we might, for example, all agree that we want to respect the opinion of the advisor, right? So we might all, for example, just have the same preference for the decision for voting. Like, is it something that's like what you're imagining, or do you think that there should be something that's separate? Like, advisor can say something, but for example, CVC, like, okay, that sounds good, but we still think that it should be like other way. Or do you think that, for example, if an advisor says, oh, based on this, we recommend this, then CVC should generally try to follow it unless like they strongly disagree? Like, what's your thought on it?
Yeah, really good topic, right? So my assumption is that CVCs will be quite, I guess lazy isn't the right word, but they'll be kind of like, they're not here to do a ton of work. So very rarely will they be like, I'll rewrite the whole thing from scratch and take care of everything myself, right? Like, we should expect the CVCs want to sit back, get everything handed to them on a silver platter, and then all they do is sort of make the final decisions of like, they should get the decisions handed to them on a silver platter as well, right? So the delegates would be like, okay, here's 2 options, pros and cons of each option. Delegates would never try to push them in one particular direction, right? Although they might try to highlight the facts around, well, this option seems to correspond more to how you usually, your values or something like that, right? But yeah, basically, it like CVCs can ultimately do whatever they want, right? They can disagree with an advisory council output, and they can even disagree so much that they decide to try to fire the advisor or to try to offboard them as a result. But for the most part, good advisors that, of course, it's going to take us time to get there, right? But especially also with the help of the constitutional delegates and sort of acting as the sort of translators and the supporters in this, then I think what will happen is the advisory councils will come with the same kind of technical, like what I would call the governance technical solution for everyone, right? It's like the elements and the nesting of the elements and the language and so on will be exactly the same that they will show to each CVC. And then what they will do is they will highlight, these are the variables that we think you can adjust. And if you adjust it this way, then it's more dovish. And they might sort of suggest that. Of course, it's up to the CVC to decide whether they think that's the case. And if you adjust it this way, then it might be more hawkish, they might say. And then there might also be sort of, and here's something where if you adjust it like this, then it becomes more refi. And if you adjust it this other way, then it becomes more healthcare or something, right? Because there's all these, there's multiple spectrums right? One thing is hawk versus dove, which is the most dominant one that happens in most cases. But there's also like the spectrum of where do we allocate the purpose funds? There's also the spectrum of like which, like how do we focus on acquiring new users? Do we focus on deep crypto or emerging markets or savings or spending or whatever? And it's all about, a good advisory council will make the rules all about highlighting those levers so they're easy to operate without putting any kind of bias into them.
I see. I just have a related question, and also I'm sorry for talking all the way extra. So for others, if you have also questions or others, feel free to chime in. But so because we also know that one of the roles of also facilitator, especially in terms of like strategy for CVC, is that if it goes too different from like for example, Growth CVC is Dovish CVC. Let's say the advisor gives advice to auto CVC that big cuts are needed, that basically a lot of like hawkish actions are needed, and it's very urgent. Let's say, so let's say we also like Growth CVC also decide to act on it, and then basically act on the hawkish. Can facilitator be like, hey, I know that you listen to the advisor, but still from the average user, you're basically betraying your camp in a way. So that's ground for example, getting de-recognized. Like, do you imagine that kind of edge case happening, or is it just a little bit? You should be more flexible. Like, what's your thought on it?
Yeah, I think that's more. I mean, I guess the spectrums would be more relative than absolute, right? So it's more like if it's obvious that we just lost half of all the users and income is down massively, we have to cut budgets. Then it's obvious that like a Dovish CVC has to cut budgets, but they probably would cut them less than a very hawkish CVC. Yeah, I mean, it all comes back to being able to argue that this fits with the overall vision or something like that, right? It could also be, I mean, and when you think about it in this relative sense, it could also be the other way around, right? You could have a situation then where the Dovish CVC proposes the most extreme cuts, while a hawkish CVC doesn't. And then what could happen is that the hawkish CVC, like then one of them could be in the wrong, and one of them could potentially get derecognized. I mean, that would be really extreme, right? But one of them could potentially be derecognized, and then the question of which one that would be should really be sort of like trying to look at the facts of like what is really like sort of how, income fell with 50%, and then a hawkish CVC suggests a 10% budget slashing. That could suggest they're actually like sleeping and they're just not like, they're sort of disenfranchising their voters, right? Because there's just there doesn't seem to be sort of a logical connection. Yeah, but this is a tricky one to figure out, right? But on the other hand, CVCs will be very incentivized to try to figure this out over time, because all the top CVCs, their objective should always be to try to make the bar as high as possible for other CVCs to participate, right? Like there should be like, if you like, they ideally want to put a sort of a moat in place. That means like a CVC has to be like really highly functioning and cannot make like logical mistakes and so on. And if that happens, then it should be, I mean, it should get derecognized and start over again or something, right? And then of course, at the same time, it should be really easy to then lean on the delegates to figure it out, right? Delegates should be able to step in and very easily be like, okay, let's help, we'll help you out, and we'll make sure that you don't fall into the trap of breaking the Constitution by, sort of saying you're hawkish, but doing something that could objectively be shown to be relatively dovish compared to where everyone else is going and sort of the facts that we see.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and that's also where I can imagine that constitutional delegates will be very helpful, because especially I would say that a lot of CVC members, let's say within Growth CVC, is unlikely to attend other CVC calls, right? Like initially maybe to learn, but in the long term unlikely. So it'd be really up to constitutional delegates to be like, hey, like other CVCs are trying to think about this. So if we try to do this, then compared to them, we'll be actually more extreme. So we should try to think of other way, maybe. Like, I do think that eventually the language will be a little bit helpful, right? Because I think suggesting and also, guiding, those are a little bit tricky. But I think that, that's probably also the role where the constitutional delegates are important, because they are the ones that, attend all of those, or at least attend as much as possible, right?
But I think, like, in terms of neutrality, I think just selection bias is extremely powerful, right? So like that actually doesn't exist, right? You can abstain from, like spinning stuff by making it more emotional, but there will always be I can never be neutral just by the way that of the facts I select, right? So I think, and I can also be very tactical about that. So I think this is something where different CDs then probably like cancel each other out, or like so the CVC will then get a more complete picture of the terrain they're in by surfacing multiple opinions.
Yeah, I think to continue that is that I think it makes sense why Rune also mentioned that those cities also have such roles, right? Because especially if CVCs are supposed to be more relaxed, and then a lot of research is in a way like fed to them, then you can also imagine that from both strategy as well as such like landscape, it's also important for constituent delegates to give such information, and it's very likely that as a CVC, you're likely to reward those in CDs who can also provide accurate and also important information, right? I mean, I'm not saying that they are like spies. It's more like those facts and information. So I think those are pretty interesting. Great. Do we have some other fundamentals that we want to discuss today? Okay, I see. Let's say point. However, I expect there will be always some species members who pay a lot of attention across the ecosystem, and could spot a CD that tries to manipulate opinions with selective disclosures. It's an interesting point, and about like I would say delegate, loyalty in a way, but because technically, so this was also something that I think some of the members kind of talk about on the Discord and others. Is like, well, technically CVC can ban CDs, and there's no real like, at least within Constitution, it doesn't say that they only have to ban them under certain circumstances, right? So technically, you might have some that you might favor more, but then whether that creates this kind of culture of okay, sorry, or other cities may get political points for whistleblowing on other cities if they do something, and there's evidence of that can be pointed out. It's also possible. So I do think that there might be eventually a culture of the cities taking many different roles, right? Like they should give facts, but at the same time, like if they favor certain CVC very much, then I think based on game theory, it's also possible that they might get banned for other CVC because other CVC might be like, hey, I saw that you're doing much more work for other CVC. For our CVC, you're not doing much, so we're not going to reward you with much less delegation or even ban you. It's possible. We'll have to see how it works, but that's a very interesting way to also think about it. Which also goes back to another fundamental question, which is actually, so this was also before CVC brought it up, is that for each CVC, is it okay to have a different culture as well as different setups? Which was a big question that was discussed over the weekends as well. If anybody wants to chime in their opinion, and also Kianga can also share their your opinion as well. I mean, it's the initial like CVC meetings. I don't think that we have to restrict it to CVC member per se for now, unless there's a rule like that. Okay, and then following with some of the discussion points, Rune also said that okay, and they say another point is the cities also provide very biased solution to particular challenges, but the important point is that the bias they provide should be the CVC bias, not their own. Their own bias shouldn't exist, or rather shouldn't be disclosed. Interesting. All right. So I think that some of the fundamental points I think can be discussed as we discuss more. I do want to take time today to also talk about the scope that we're supposed to talk about, as well as talking about some of the strategy, because I saw on especially Discord the question about like, okay, it's a it's a dovish CVC, but it's a cautious what does it even mean? I think it's a good question as well. So I think that it's also good to maybe spend some time to talk about it. I don't think there's a rule regarding like how long the meeting should be, and especially it's the initial meeting. I'll try to continue the meeting till we kind of run out of things to talk about. So let's go to the scope. I know that three of delegate already shared its opinion, but anybody else also has some discussion points? Also, even before that, Rune also says, so a CD that represents both keys and growth could go to growth and say, we think the best option is to increase budget X to twice as much, and then provide evidence for why that proposal is congruent with the CVC's bias based on prior action and opinion shared by the CVC members. Yes, and I think that this is also a reason why CD's role will be very important, and also CDs will have to do a lot of research and also analysis to be like top CDs in theory, because you can imagine that from CVC, at least based on game theory, the more value you can provide to CVs, they should be also the ones that reward you, or at least in theory, right? All right, I think okay, and then continue with the. Cities can only vote for the option with the votes they have the delegate to growth strategy, and will have to vote against it with the case vote they control. When we finally come to rule work to be done, just by cold run, shall we really discuss everything in detail here, or is that just start working, I think, on real documents at the budget council? Okay, and actually, team also bring up a good question. We have the risk and ALM experts here. So what expertise do they need on the AC? Where are the gaps? Actually, Tim, do you want to maybe share more on that if you want to speak?
I mean, I think the question is relatively clear. I'm just kind of in two places at once, checking over to make sure I understand the advisory thing. If I understand it correctly, basically the facilitators bring together projects with that council. And so I'm sort of curious from the merged scope perspective of risk and ALM, considering we have those facilitators, I believe, on the call, what their thoughts were for some of their first suggestions of either projects or people they wanted to bring on board. And then I guess also a question to the chat. That would be next quarter that they present that as well. So it's two questions.
Yes. Okay. Or anybody, I mean, it can be also other members who have certain opinions about it. Anybody wants to speak about this?
Yeah, hey guys, I am Rema. I am with not on Zoom, so you can see my real name. But yeah, basically, since this is kind of a new thing, we didn't, we still didn't grasp this merge in detail yet. But we definitely started to think about it. So I believe the strategic finance is already working on some new proposal, basically Mark will probably talk about this. But inside the risk team, we also started to think more about ALM since the scopes are merging. And we are planning to post something on the forum in regards to this. But right now, I don't have anything very concrete to suggest. Basically, how I assume things will happen is that based on these two proposals, which are, can be basically a starter to the discussion, and basically feedback from the community, which will probably be in the form of the CVC meetings. Then basically, so essentially when we basically, come to the conclusion what exactly needs to happen, then we will have like much better understanding. Is this something that basically current teams can develop on our own, or do we need to basically hire somebody who is more has higher expertise in this specific field? Yeah, this is how I'm currently thinking about this.
Yep. Also, this is more for, I think, Gulf Alpha in terms of setup. So for CVC calls, so CDs, of course, can speak as well as potential advisors in the future, and facilitators can also speak their opinions. Right? Is that correct? Like, I just want to kind of see, can they give their opinions, or is it just like they can just advise in a way?
Facilitators have to do the same as constitutional delegates in that they can't have a political agenda, right, or like a bias. But in the same way, the constitutional delegates, I mean, the example I made before, where you can say, well, you're the growth CVC, so it makes sense for you to want to increase the budget or something. So I think that would be the same type of input that facilitators can give, right? But you can't have a facilitator be like, we like this CVC and we don't like that other CVC, unless they're like saying you're unconstitutional and just got de-recognized, right? That would be, so, and that's kind of the dynamic. Like CVCs are more day-to-day sort of marginal, this stuff, and constitutional delegates and facilitators are more like, we're completely neutral, and if we have to step in, then it's a very sort of edge case, serious situation. But so anyway, so what that means is you can absolutely get input, right? It's just that we need to avoid bias basically being provided, right? The bias should be provided by the CVC, and then facts and knowledge can come from facilitators and CDs.
Yes, that's quite interesting.
So actually in this call, Du is the only one who can actually like have this clear, or should actually have this clear opinion, right? Like because he's at the moment, due to the recency of the CVC, he's the only member here in this call. So actually it's his opinion now to set kind of the bias and agenda for the meeting, like in which direction he wants it to evolve. I think this is the way it's meant to be, right?
Yeah, I don't know who said it before, but basically Du is the king in the castle, right? We are all here to help him make the decisions he wants to make.
But I know how Caesar died, so I would rather be our castle rather than alone. But anyway, so Rune also wrote, I would suggest the first step should we think about how to procure AML advice proactively for the long run. In all cases, we need multiple voices on the advisory council. Of course, it is very important to get as much input as possible from BA labs and other to better understand who and how to procure AML advice. So I think that we can maybe tie this together with, because I think some of the others are asking about like my bias, or at least my view, and then maybe we can tie this together, which is that, so I want to, at least this CVC, to focus on growth, right? And the growth meaning that we'll be willing to experiment, as well as that have to grow. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to say yes to everything or blindly. We are going to look at, because we also have to understand the resources are finite, right? So how do we grow the best, right? And sometimes, as Rune mentioned, like sometimes cuts might be necessary, right? Because you might have to allocate resources or shuffle some of the resources internally. And I do agree that for the growth, it's important to focus on long term rather than short term, right? Because even if, let's say, we can almost exploit it to get like a small profit in the short term. Like if in the long term it's going to actually prohibit maker from growing, then that kind of defeats the purpose. At least that's kind of my view on it. So that also goes back to Rune's point about, okay, so how can we also help to get then such advisory council, and then how should we approach it? Anybody want to share their thoughts on it as well? Also, don't be shy. Like, I don't think anybody's going to judge.
I think Seb had some great ideas about ALM, right? He wrote this one post, but on the other hand, I think it would also be really good to get some people outside of Maker just to get this fresh perspective and fresh set of eyes. So happy for any suggestions there.
Okay, so Rune also said one point I think should be considered is that we should get AML advice from people who have worked on ALM in the past. And yes, Seb is the right person to go have good opinions of what to look for when procuring AML advice. I use that to increase the so actually, this is another good question. Is that so? Let's say that CVC. So I guess this is also a question for Rune as well as relevant actors that can voice on it, which is like, okay, so let's say the Growth CVC is like, okay, we agree that we should try to find such, right? Then the question is that then Growth CVC, cannot, for example, tell constitutional, delegates to be like, okay, then let's go and try to find potential candidates, right? Like that's not within the mandate, right? That's up to, let's say, facilitator or others. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we were talking about this yesterday as well, right? That it's very important that CVCs are not able to micromanage, because then, I mean, their incentive would be to like pick their cousin, right, and like write their cousin into the scope framework. Like, for ALM, you gotta hire a cousin make cousin face, right? And that's the only person you can hire and the only company, because they're the best in the world, and that's now written in the scope, and that's what you gotta do. And of course, that's just not allowed. Basically, we just have like the Constitution sort of preventing that. But what should be, I mean, the way you then prevent the facilitator from just hiring someone bad or hiring the facilitator's cousin or something is to then say, like, has to be someone that can demonstrate a lot of skill related to ALM. It has to be someone with experience. It has to be a big name brand, or maybe it has to be someone who, whatever, can, first they got to output something, and then we got to look at that, and only then do we do the big project. Like these kind of objective measures, right? That's what CVCs can and really should be using to the maximum benefit.
Yes, that's a good point. Also, Kenga also points a good point. Say, one way to approach this would be, me to think about like, personally want to learn or better understand about AML issues. For myself and Refi CVC, it could be analysis on what went wrong in Silicon Valley Bank, lack of hedges, and so on, and what are the applications to take away from a maker perspective. Yeah, I mean, it's also possible that maybe such, even if a brief overview might be helpful. So I think it's kind of interesting, right? Because CVC cannot micromanage, so I don't think that maybe CVC can be like, okay, we demand, let's say, such report, but maybe it's possible that if there's such resource, then it'll be also good to at least help to make decisions regarding it. But anyway, okay, and then there's a discussion between Rune and Code Knight about it. Okay, so Code Knight said growth ideas expand the ranges for MIP6. 65 type treasury investment, use that to increase DSR and support high demand. And then we'll say this is a good direction to pursue, but I'll add two things. First is that rather than charge ahead and try to immediately edit the scope to try to do this, the most important place to start is to determine how to hire advisors that can improve our ranges for the long term, so we can get ahead of the problem proactively. Another thing is that this is the opinion I'm pushing across the board, that the CVC should specify that such new advisory projects must prevent it until the AML project is on a satisfactory path. To avoid the problem of focusing on more exciting things than not getting the crucial AML figure out. I see. And then do we have basic kind of overview of like where we are at? Basically like I assume that Endgame just passed, so I assume that we haven't been on the path to, for example, try to find those advisors yet, right? Like, so this is just initial discussion. Is that correct?
Yeah, no one further has been put forth other than the responsible facilitators.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Early discussion. I wonder whether it would be helpful for CVCs, for example, those who know AML to present to CVCs about maybe some of the potential. For example, Crow or others. I think maybe can give some overview of how they can help, as well as like some comparison, like maybe just very basic things. But I do think that like from the Growth CVC, like we don't have mandate to ask the team to do it per se. So I'm not sure whether we can make suggestions. Okay, but the impression I have got is actually contracting Crow at this stage is premature. They're too big and not flexible enough to understand that we just need some basic things, but need them in order to quick to reality. So it's interesting. Large consider. Oh, okay, yes. Consultants will be happy to take our money. So this is also just a question, but so there are some consulting / like more, especially crypto native companies that do, for example, different kind of advising, right? So whether that's like Delphi Digital or others, like, are those something that's like at least, especially from Rune and like from facility perspective, is something considering, or are we looking at, for example, just those like big names in big industries? You can also share your opinions, because I think it comes to that, like a lot of big consulting companies, let's say like Accenture or others, like it's possible that they might not be familiar with, for example, DAO especially, right? Or how, for example, C5, D5 work together yet, for example. So there might be some companies, like even it can be maker's partner. I know that it's a little bit odd, but like has been working on such for a long time. Like, is this something that would be acceptable to, for example, have them as an advisor? Though it might be a little bit conflict of interest, I understand, but that's an interesting point too. All right, and then there's a discussion between Genga and Run. Genga said there is a articulation clarity that's always been lacking, so CVCs enforce this by being specific about sequencing work and have words in the scopes outlining the terms of what sufficient progress look like, timelines before focusing on other things. And Run said yes, and the more it is spelled out, the better, because in my experience, controlling the prioritization is one of my biggest problems ever in Make. So like be really, really specific about the money simply cannot be paid out unless conditions X, Y, Z have been met. Okay. Let's see. So I think that so initially we talk about a lot of fundamental things, and then now we're talking about, okay, what should, for example, Growth CVC should focus on, and at least it seems like that we are gonna especially look at the long term, and then talk about the long term. Will we also need these such advisors? Now, the question then becomes, okay, A, how do you find such advisors? B, what are some of the parameters that for such advisors that we're kind of looking for, like, for example, budgets or things like that, right? And I assume for those is something that CDs will help us guide it, or is it facilitators? Sorry, I keep confusing. or is it both?
So could you repeat that question?
So, for example, like, so from, Growth CVC, we are, for example, let's say, moving ahead with like, okay, so we agreed that in the long term, especially for the long-term growth, we do need advisors. But the question becomes, who do you, who we want to hire as advisor? A. B is that how much are we willing to spend, right? So for those decisions to be made, or those like facts provided by CDs and facilitators, or because I also don't want to, for example, micromanage, but at least from, you can imagine from the strategy or direction, such will be helpful, right?
Yeah. Okay. Great. Great point to dig into, because this is also like these questions you just said, they are entirely in the long run determined by the CVCs. In the short run, I mean, a lot of that will also be determined by MIP 102 and this more ad hoc reactive process, right? But I'll let me I'll just try to like to really sort of show it black and white or whatever, exactly how that works, right? Then I'll just share my screen and I'll find the budget, because there is already a budget in place. And I'll show you I'll try to highlight the specific elements and like really try to highlight how exactly does this. Oh, how exactly does it work, right? Okay, so you're seeing the, so this is the stability and liquidity scope framework. Does it work? Yeah. Okay. Just check.
Yes, it works.
Okay. So, right. So the first question is, how do they find advisory council members, right? And right now, it's not very well written currently. So this is the stuff this is what needs to be fixed, and how to fix this in a way that's really good for the long run. That's what the CVCs, in my opinion, should be like, just nerding out over big time, right? I mean, that's what the CVC should be all about, obsessed with, really. Like, how do we really set ourselves up with the right advisors for the, for the next, like a year from now, and 2 years from now, and 3 years from now, right? And focus on that as the number one thing, because then the CVCs will be really well running at that point, right? If you've been very proactive during the pre-game and getting set up with the right resources. So how, like, the way the new advisory council members are found is currently this is the thing that sort of defines it, right? That basically facilitators are supposed to create ensure there's an open process with clear instructions. And then they have to review these applications and bring them to a vote in a governance poll that, I guess, implicitly follows the weekly cycle. But that's not even very well defined currently. So there was this point earlier made that there could actually be something added here, like a sub-element added here, like so something like, let's say 1.2.1.1, which is the facilitator is allowed to use the advisory council budget to hire headhunters to go out and actually find someone to then approach and encourage them to apply using this open process, for instance, right? So that would be a way to like, and it's the CVC that puts that language. I mean, it's the CVC that makes a decision that, okay, let's push for headhunters. And then it's the delegates that then say, okay, then how about we do it this way? We write out an element that says, the facilitator may use the advisory council budget to hire headhunters when they think it's appropriate or something. And then when they think it's appropriate could be further defined as something like, if there's a clear mandate saying we need this kind of project and we currently don't have anyone to do this kind of project, then that triggers, you should be allowed to then spend funds on a headhunter. And then there could be some limit. You're not allowed to spend more than 10% of the budget on a headhunter or something, right? All that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm just making all these things up, right? And I think if the CVCs think carefully about this for the next, couple of months, then we'll start to get to a point where we might have some good answers to this, right? And then we're solving the problem from the right place, starting off with the very basics of like how to hire the right advisors to get the right advice, right? Sorry, let me just scroll down. Let me just show the budget here, right? So this is where the budget is. So this thing can be, I mean, so this 1.3.5 on 1A is controlled through this one, 1.3.5. Yeah, I think the way this is defined, basically this is a kick, right? I mean, I guess it should be DSS best. It's really badly defined. This is going to be improved in the next edit, right? But basically, the way this is defined right now, then this basically allows the stability and liquidity facilitator to basically request, hey, the scope says I should get a kick to a multi-sig or something that I control with this rate of 500,000 for 3 months. Put that into a spell and activate that ASAP because I need to spend the money. Right? And then once they have that kick, then they can actually go ahead and spend it. And the restrictions on how they can spend it is all spending must be limited to only what is deemed necessary and with a high probability of producing clearly measurable value. And above that, even more importantly, it says the responsible facilitators have a budget available to pay for advisory council projects per quarter. So there's this like sort of very specific thing of like advisory. This is what this budget can be spent on. And then again, it's up to the CVCs to like fix this and make it much better because right now this is not very good. And it needs to be more specific and more guardrails and more adversarial. Like let's assume the facilitators are going to try to rip us off. Or let's assume that they're very incompetent, and because facilitators should basically just be like robots, right? They just like do what they're told. In fact, ideally, they use, and as soon as possible, we have this in place. Like they will use LLMs to just do it for them, right? They'll just use AI to like read it and produce a set of actions and take those actions, sanity check it's not going haywire, and then just go ahead and do it. And really not as little as possible think for themselves. The thinking for themselves, that's the CVCs. And then they put it into writing. And then it's in writing. It's like an instruction set you can just follow with sort of your brain turned off almost. Ideally, right? Of course, we'll never fully get there. But that should always be the direction we're trying to go in.
I see. So I think that from CD side, then they should suggest some changes and then share it in the CVC call. Is that kind of correct? Like what CDs also should do, or is it also up to like CVC member? Yeah, okay, it'll be up to define how they work. Yeah, I think that was also the point that I remember I had a discussion with the King about on the forum, which is like, so we have to, for example, make some edits and make work, like what is the work actually defined, right? Like, is it just having the meeting to allow people to talk, or is it that we have to make specific changes and then basically submit? I'm sure that GovAlpha will help with, for example, submitting into on-chain, or document. That was also the discussion points. I know that I will watch the last night's CVC call once it's online, but was there also something that was talked about, like what is work defined as? Okay. Okay. So Rune said it'll be up to CVC to define how that works. And yes, the budget is universal for all the CVCs and are meant to be neutral, not inject any bias of particular CVC, but instead help each CVC with how they could potentially inject their own bias. Okay. And Peyton said ecosystem for master with them, arbitration for the more particulars. Also before. Okay. So that was also the response to one some question about does the DAO plan on voting on whether the budget delivery is acceptable, and also, or would that be up to CVC to receive an acceptable delivery? Okay, sounds good. I know that we already talked for an hour, and I know that we had a lot of different ideas regarding how we can improve the scope. I know that it has. I guess maybe next time there should be like a Word document, and then eventually, especially once the CVC becomes bigger, or at least like one of the CDs, agrees to be, let's say, moderator or like note taker or others. Also, since the scopes are getting merged, we can just continue the discussion next. Well, yeah, that's possible too. So this is also some paper. Okay, so Kenga also points out, not too much in details what you're getting at. Still an open question where and who picks up the ball on putting words on paper. At the end of the day, we CVCs have to ratify every time something. So for this quarter, I expect I will need to take responsibility on some writing. Since there will be also stability, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think the King also brings a good point about like, for example, let's say CVCs become bigger and more constant, and the CDs, for example, we believe there could be also like moderators. Then it's also possible to, for example, ask CDs to write them in, such document, and then CD members, CVC members just check them, and if it's acceptable, then to call alpha. Like, is this something that's acceptable? I think that's also the question that I think some CVC members have been wondering across different CVC. It could be that the work just becomes relatively minimal, whereas missing of a single or few elements. Let's see. Yeah, I think in practice, then I think what will happen is, well, so for this discussion, it will continue next week because it's going to be merged eventually. So I think what maybe we can do for Growth CVC next week is that basically have a Word document and then try to write such suggestions down. I think for now, there's no really other moderators, so it'll be slow, but at least we'll be able to make potential suggestions, which hopefully also count toward improving the protocol as well as counting as a work. So maybe we'll try that next week. All right. Any other discussion points that we want to have for today's call? Anybody? Okay. Considering the other. Thanks for this meeting. Okay, yep. So I think that maybe we can just wrap up here. Enjoy your day and have a nice week. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you.